Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, contributing editor for The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today for our forum on improving treatment and recovery for opioid use disorder across the criminal justice system. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Indivior, for their support of today's event. Opioid use is highly prevalent among incarcerated individuals, yet only a small percent of them receive medication-assisted treatment in jails and prisons. Studies have shown that treatment for opioid use disorder within correctional settings can reduce the risk of overdose and reincarceration. Today's conversations are going to explore the roadblocks that incarcerated individuals face in receiving effective support and treatment. And we're going to examine what it will take to ensure a safe and successful return to society and the role that recovery services and diversion programs play. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillOpioids. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania sits on the Judiciary Committee and is a member of the Bipartisan Addiction and Mental Health Task Force. The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack, my friend, spoke with her earlier this week. Take a listen.
Congresswoman Dean, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Bob.
Well, opioids is a very personal issue to you, your son, and you've written about this. Has dealt with addiction. Can you tell us that personal story?
Certainly. And Bob, feel free to call me Matt or Madeleine. And thanks for asking. My son and I wrote a book about our experience, his experience as he fell into addiction to opioids, my experience trying to figure out what was going so terribly wrong with him, but much more importantly, the story of him getting help. He slipped into addiction over the course of about 8 to 10 years, and was very good at hiding it, very good at manipulating what was going on. And you can imagine, as a mother, I was in a panic because I could tell from his affect and also his physical appearance that something was terribly wrong with him. So we battled for years. We finally figured it out and confronted him, and he said yes to help. So I have taken this personally for a very long time. Addiction is a disease. Substance use disorder is a disease. And so my entire public life, 6.5 years as a state representative and now 3.5 years in Congress, I've been working to destigmatize the issue. If I can tell my story and say it happened in our household, I almost don't know any household that doesn't have some connection to mental health issues, addiction issues. So thank you for asking. There is hope in recovery.
As far as people who are watching, because I imagine that was just an incredible struggle for you, what advice do you have for families? You have experience of going through this difficult process, and obviously it's not one size fits all, but what would you advise to parents and family members, to people who are addicted?
Well, I would say, number one, as parents, trust your gut. My gut told me it was drugs, but Harry was very, very clever at hiding it. I would drug test him and he would anticipate it and somewhat beat the test. So trust your gut, get professional help. I leaned on a friend who had been through it and is now a person in the recovery world, helping others. So seek professional help. Don't think you're alone. Don't think you're crazy. And just keep reaching out to your family member who is addicted. Harry is now 9.5 years, a little more than 9.5 years in recovery from opioid use and addiction. He's now in that same space, helping others claim recovery through treatment and continued treatment. So I would just say, trust your gut, seek professional help, and recognize you are not alone. Don't walk in a shadow of fear or shame. This can happen to anyone. It is a disease. It is not a moral failure.
Big picture, you've been working on this for a long time. What have we been doing right, and what do we need to keep doing? Because this issue, honestly, I think has been with the pandemic, obviously has not helped the situation, but people are not maybe talking about it as much as they were before the pandemic. So where do you think that we've succeeded, and where do you think we need to pass them? And obviously, I know you've introduced a lot of legislation on this issue.
Well, I will say we've succeeded in talking about it more. I think that is powerful and important. And families who talk to me who've been through this, maybe lost a loved one, they're thankful that we are talking about it. We're trying to pull back the curtain of shame and stigma, but we have a long way to go. I absolutely know that. I think we've been somewhat successful in prevention, but I think we have a very far way to go with that. When I think of how we educate our young people, we have to be really honest with them. My son tells the story around going through the DARE program when he was young and realizing, oh my goodness, he pledged to himself, never, never, never. Maybe we have to relook at the DARE program, because what the DARE program, it does some very powerfully good things, but it also just says drugs are bad and then connects the person to bad. So we have to speak about it differently and with compassion and greater understanding. I know you know this, but we are talking about now during the pandemic, 110,000 people have died of overdose in a 12-month period that ended April of last year. 110,000 people. That is 300 people every single day in this country. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 365 people, 365 days in the year. I call it a jetliner a day, Bob. In this country, what we've got to do is figure out how we land this plane. When Boeing had 2 jetliners go down within weeks of each other, claiming souls, they said, land the plane until we figure out what we can do. We need in this country to do everything we can to put resources toward prevention, treatment, destigmatization, decriminalization. There's so much there. Something good we did that I think is little noticed is the American Rescue Plan, where we put $3 billion we distributed to states and territories in order to combat addiction and to help people get into recovery. That's a powerful set of resources. And there's so much more in the American Rescue Plan around the issue of addiction. I'm mighty proud of this administration, President Biden. He and I have talked about it in terms of what we're going to do for those who are suffering from the disease of addiction.
You've introduced legislation on incarcerated individuals, and that's not something that we talk about maybe enough. What is the issue as far as addiction in prisons and jails that really needs to be fixed? This is something that we talk about 300 people dying a day, but very few people are thinking. I think about people who are incarcerated, and some would say, well, why should we focus on them? Why should we spend money on them?
Because they're human beings. We should absolutely spend money on people who are incarcerated. Number one, most of them will re-enter society. So do you want them to re-enter society having been invested in so that they will succeed? Or do you want to not invest in them and they will come out and too often fall back into substance use disorder and using, too oftentimes to die? Or recidivism, being rearrested, brought back to prison. People who are suffering with addiction, it is a disease. Sadly, you might imagine, I sit on Judiciary, and there was a sad set of arguments being made back and forth on some of the legislation around incarcerated people and treatment. People need treatment while they are incarcerated, and then connection to treatment and recovery as they leave. And I heard a member on the other side of the dais arguing, just arrest them, throw them in jail, that'll stop it. Well, of course, that shows a woeful ignorance around the disease of addiction. So some legislation that I have introduced, one is for educating people, training people as they are incarcerated, the PrEP Act. I had the chance of introducing that alongside Elijah Cummings in 2019. So that's for education, training, to make sure that people have some ability to find suitable employment so that they will not hopefully go back to the streets and maneuver toward crime, drug use, drug sales, and other things. The other thing we have to look at is who's incarcerated. We were talking about my son. You can imagine my son is a white kid. And when he was young, he looked pretty darn young, and he drove a decent car, and he had a suburban address. He talks a lot about being treated unfairly fair. He'd be pulled over. It would be obvious he had had a problem or had been using, and the police officer would take one look at his license and say, "Kid, get home." That doesn't happen for everybody. That doesn't happen for those who are impoverished. That doesn't happen for those people of color. we know that way too often, Black and brown people, poor people, are arrested for their drug use, not offered treatment. So there's so much we can do to figure out how we don't send so many people to prison for a disease, and how, when they are in prison, we get them treatment so that when they re-enter society, they have a chance to continue recovery.
As we live in such polarizing times nowadays, but obviously opioid kills Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Has this been an issue that you've seen a lot of bipartisanship on? I mean, just in general, in dealing with opioids, because obviously it affects every district and every state in the nation. I
do see bipartisanship on this one. I don't see a greatest sense of urgency, as I said, with that horrific number, 110,000 dead in 12 months. But there is serious bipartisanship, and it gives me hope. I think you're going to be interviewing David Joyce. He has a lot. He has a lot of proposed legislation. He cares deeply about this issue. We have an addiction caucus. It is very bipartisan, bicameral. So yes, this is a place where we can agree, because you're absolutely right. Overdose deaths are stealing people of every color, creed, educational status, economic status. I sadly was recently at the funeral of a friend of ours, 24-year-old white, young man, struggled with addiction and sadly died. And you know what his parents said as I came up to see them in the church? They hugged me and said, "Please, we must do more about it. Please pass legislation that will help with prevention, or offer people greater recovery, harm reduction, and of course, treatment if they happen to be incarcerated."
And that leads to my last question. It's a midterm election, everybody's charged up and looking towards November. I know a number of bills have passed the House and haven't gotten the votes in the Senate. Are you hopeful that some piece or pieces of legislation could pass sometime this year? Maybe it's after the election, maybe it's a lame duck, but could be attached to some moving vehicle?
I certainly hope so. We passed out of the House the Fairness in Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act that would close the loophole that prevents us from getting some of the most innovative treatments for substance use disorder, medication assisted treatments. That's passed the House. It's in the Senate. Things like that, I think we should be able to get bipartisan support. And of course, making sure that whatever we do has a holistic approach. I really want us to do more in the area of harm reduction. I don't know, Bob, if you've ever visited an area of Philadelphia, Kensington. Have you had a chance to be there?
I've been in Philly, but not Kensington, I don't think.
I ask you to go. I ask members of Congress to go. It is a hellscape of poverty and substance use disorder ravaging souls. And so there are very good groups there trying to help people, trying to get them into recovery. But it was there that the city was going to put up a safe injection site, but that became very controversial, and so they didn't do it. We have to think outside the box. It is not inappropriate to protect people while they are struggling with addiction, to save their lives. Naloxone, safe injection sites. But we have so much more to do. So I do hope that in this Congress, there's an awful lot going on, so many extraordinarily pressing issues. We have important elections in my state of Pennsylvania. I hope we will make sure we do something to reduce the loss of life and get more people into recovery and reduce addiction. I've literally talked to President Biden about it. He takes it personally too. So I'm pleased with what he's trying to do by way of executive order. And I know he hopes some of this legislation gets to his desk.
Well, Congresswoman Dean or Mad, thank you for joining. You have a compelling story, especially with your son, and it's such an important issue, and we all appreciate the work you do on this.
Thank you for your important coverage. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.